border, and they kept on making booze during our prohibition, and so it became a ready market, this kind of relationship, all across the 3,000-mile border between us and Canada. A lot of manufacturing was done in where Quebec is, that province is, so it became very easy to move the stuff. The other thing is that there are native tribes whose reservations are in both countries. And even years back, the governments of Canada and the United States allowed them to be sovereign nations. So they also got involved in the booze business because they could bring it into Canada, and on their reservation, they could move it right into the United States and on their way to merry places, particularly in New York City, where there are like thousands of speakeasies. Prohibition was one of the federal government's worst ideas. It was pushed by people who meant well, but just didn't understand the idea that if you prohibit something that people are used to, they're going to go and get it anyway. And when they go and get it anyway, they create a huge market. And prohibition was the beginning of organized crime. Because there was always crime, anywhere, all over the country, all over the world, but it became organized because there was so much money to be made in prohibition with the alcohol that they created what was then a commission. And the commission, just like if you were running a regular business, they divided up the territories and you were not supposed to infringe on someone else's territory. Some people just didn't get the message. People like Dutch Schultz. Now, Dutch Schultz and my grandfather got together in a kind of unusual way. Both gentlemen were actually born in the United States. My granddad was born in Jersey City, and Dutch Schultz came from the Bronx. They were both from immigrant Jewish families. And it was when they started to get a relationship, a business relationship in 1920, Dutch Schultz was 19 years old, and my grandfather was a man in his 40s with 5 children. And so they begin an unusual relationship that lasts throughout Prohibition. 1933, President Roosevelt gets elected, and on his platform is the repeal of the act that allowed for prohibition. And so the prohibition ends in 1933. And my grandfather and Dutch Schultz remain business partners for a couple of years after that. How did my grandfather get involved? That's why I called him the accidental gangster. My grandfather was a fisherman, and he had plenty of boats. And so the whole idea was they invited him for lunch one day, Dutch Schultz, and he said, I want to use your boats to distribute pick up my booze from Canada, bring it to the United States. And if Dutch Schultz, even at 19, asked you to do something, unless you wanted to go home in a coffin, you said, oh, sir, when will we did? And so that begins their relationship. And my grandfather, because he's kind of like this father figure to Dutch Schultz, tries to keep the guy in line, does not succeed very much. Dutch Schultz is a very impulsive young man. And his big fault, which led to his demise earlier than perhaps he had hoped for, was that he was greedy. Now, all these gangsters had something, some Achilles heel about them, but Dutch Schultz's was that he was way too greedy. He was making a fortune, so why did he have to skim some of the profits? Why did he have to cheat his employees? He had 100 people working for him. My grandfather was only one, because that was just his personality. And among these gangsters, they all had some kind of Achilles heel, and in many ways, it led to their demise way earlier than their mother and father would have expected. So here's my grandfather. He gets invited to lunch once, and Dutch Schultz says, I want to use your fishing boats. And he said, okay. And so that's how that began that relationship. And what they had to do was to bring the boats to the international border, the international line in the ocean. So they didn't have to come my grandfather didn't have to go to Canada to collect the booze. He only had to go like 3 to 5 miles outside. And then they transferred the booze from manufacturer, the Canadian manufacturers, to my grandfather's boats, and then my grandfather's boats took it to the beaches, and that's where they would be transferred onto trucks, and then the truck would take it to the like 1,000 speakeasies all over the New York metropolitan area. And that was the whole process. And my grandfather began to sort of be like a gangster. He carried a gun, which he never had before. And my grandmother was always really deathly afraid. That's cute, deathly. Because she expected one day, any day, that he would either be killed by either the police or fellow gangsters. These were not trustworthy people. But my grandmother agreed when the son got married, they invited these gangsters to come to the wedding because they were in many ways business partners. And everybody in the neighborhood knew that my grandfather worked for Dutch Schultz because my Aunt Minnie would go in the street and say, I work for Dutch Schultz. And everybody knew who Dutch Schultz was from the newspapers, that he was this really very dangerous man. So no one did anything to any of the kids or anything else because everybody was afraid of Dutch Schultz. And I put in the book, now the book is based on remembrances from my aunts and my uncle and my father who knew my grandfather. Because they were around. And so that's, it's a novel because I could not be there when my grandfather and Dutch Schultz conversation. So as a novelist, I create the atmosphere and the events that I know about through first from my family and then also from the newspapers. I went through 1930s, 1920 New York Daily News and found lots of stories. Now, Dutch Schultz, like Al Capone, wanted to be in the public light. They just loved cameras. And they loved the fact that they could be on the front page. My grandfather didn't. He had no interest in being in any newspaper, and he could understand how this potentially, if everybody knew where he lived, that there was potential danger for his wife and the 5 kids. So he stayed away from that. But there were lots of gangsters. You didn't become a gangster if you were shy, reclusive kind of individual. I mean, that was not going to happen. And most of the gangsters in this period were men, and most of them were immigrants because they came from nothing. And in a sense, just like Dutch Schultz, if you come from nothing, you have no money, you have no status. What do you got to lose? So he's a 19-year-old kid. He got to lose. Now, Schultz was not his real name. The Arthur Flugenheim. He wanted to be in the Daily News in the newspaper, and he didn't. His long name was not going to do it. So he takes the name of Schultz. Now, there's some discussion about how he got that. My interpretation in the book is that he got it from, there was a Schultz trucking company in the Bronx, and he borrowed that name forever. There are other stories about how he got that name. But the big thing is he changed his name because he wanted to be front page, and he didn't want them to mess up spelling his name. Didn't want to be asked how you spell your name. So that was that was one of the reasons why he goes ahead and does this. Yes.
Well, how did he spell it? Because my ancestors are Schultz's. So the spell with a T or not a T?
Yeah, with a T. Oh, here. It is Schultz. Is that the way your relatives spelled it?
No.
No. Okay. Again, we think he was, his family was German. They were German Jews who had come earlier time period. My friend, my own family, and Schultz's family also, they had this kind of European Jewish ancestry, and so they had a connection. They had a connection also because I don't know what happened to Dutch Schultz's family, his parents, but here's my 40-ish grandfather and his 19-year-old son, and they're like making nice together. And it just sort of clicked. I think my grandfather took a kind of fatherly interest in his kid. It didn't make him rich, but it did give him a money. And my grandfather was smart enough to see how you could really get in trouble with the law, being in the gangster business, not so much by distributing and selling the booze, as doing that, making lots of money, and then paying no taxes. You know that Al Capone, you probably know this, went to jail for tax evasion. He did not go to jail for murdering people, which he did plenty of. And in fact, the evolution of prohibition is such that originally it's the local police, local judges who were so easy to bribe, but nobody ever got into real trouble. Every now and then they had to make a show and they would, you know, go into a speakeasy and break a few bottles, but in general, that was fine. It isn't until the federal government decides to get the treasury boy, want to get involved in this, because what they're looking for is not murder, but tax evasion. And that became the far more intensive, and the Fed treasury boys were not easy to bribe, unlike the county judge or the local police. They were hard to bribe. So that becomes the first beginning of the law trying to get after these guys. Now, my grandfather can see that what Dutch Schultz did not see, and that is you got to pay stuff down. So my grandfather created a whole bunch of businesses with the illegal money that he got. And so a cousin became a pharmacist, and he opened a pharmacy, which my grandfather paid for. The other one opened a car repair shop because that sense of, you know, gave a cousin some work to do. So he created, and there was a rundown hotel. He fixed up the hotel. Again, he had cousins, he had children, not necessarily his own children, but other cousins and aunts and uncles who needed employment. So that's what he did. He funneled the money into legitimate businesses. And so he never came under the microscope of the treasury boy. Dutch Schultz, on the other hand, who wants to see a picture in the newspaper, he kept two sets of books. And eventually the feds came after him. Again, not for murder, because believe me, he murdered a number of people. They wanted to get him for tax evasion. And the interesting thing about the Schultz story is that he had two trials on tax evasion. One was in Syracuse, New York, far from here. And in Syracuse, it was a hung jury. They couldn't decide on it. And the second one was in a small town here in upstate New York. And they figured the feds figured, oh, we sure got it. Here are these local farmers. They definitely are not going to be in favor of someone like a Dutch Schultz. So we're obviously going to get a conviction. Well, they made a mistake. The mistake they made was that the local farmers were making money off of these gangs because they were close to the border with Canada. And so all those kind of people, they were buying things from these little store owners. They would deliver, like my grandpa delivered cows to some farmers just to say hello and thank you. And so what happened? They actually acquitted. And the feds are just, I can't figure this out. They got Al Capone, they couldn't get this guy. And it's just different locations. And my grandfather was involved with it was bribery. No, you know, it wasn't like they gave him money, but they bribery of a different kind. And that was what turned the tables on the feds. They just didn't realize how valuable prohibition was to people who ordinarily you wouldn't think would ever do anything slightly illegal in their whole lives. And don't forget, then as we get into the 30s, we start to get into the Depression, and everybody's looking for an honor. So again, people who might ordinarily never break the law, in fact, they were open to that because they saw it in their own best interest and in the best interest of all these little towns that really had no businesses whatsoever. Just the agriculture. So that was the kind of interesting thing about Dutch Schultz, and my grandfather helping him to be able to do this stuff. The other thing that is kind of interesting about the things is that, so there's a certain group of people that are really doing well, and there's a whole bunch of people really that aren't doing well. And all of these people who aren't doing well actually find a lifeboat in Prohibition, in the booze business. And again, it's people that may not have wanted to drink, but could see that there was something in it for them. And it took a very extremely honest person to truly turn their eyes away from what was actually going on. And now, it's not in my book, but it was my grandfather's feeling that the people behind Prohibition were actually people who were white Christians who were against immigrants. And he thought it was, Catholics and Jews who they were trying to single out and pay the price of being immigrants. Now, I can't tell you that it's really, but that is what my grandfather said, and what is the family's collective wisdom about what's behind Prohibition to begin with. And of course, President Roosevelt running in 1932, one of his platforms was Prohibition. And again, why was President Roosevelt and the federal government really interested in Prohibition? They really were not all that interested in putting murderers in jail. What they wanted was the tax money that they could get instead of the gangsters. So it was chasing tax money. So none of them were moralists in the political world. They were just realists that said, oh gosh, this is the way that we can have money. And then Roosevelt in 32, we were talking about the Depression, but the Depression was not going to stop people from drinking. So if we put in 25 cents on each bottle, we'll make out fine. And that's one of the kind of strange things about what happened with, and again, there's so much money involved. And then it gives rise to this whole category of people called the bootleggers and gangsters, because the gangsters, they recognize by the late 20s that Prohibition isn't going to last forever. And they start branching out into other but they've already organized and they've already created these kinds of business arrangements and territories. As if you were a drug guy, and so they also start to get secondary business. So among the commission members is Meyer Lansky. He sees what's going on, and he gets involved in the casino business, illegal casinos. And this is before Las Vegas. This is before before New Jersey, and then of course what we have today. So he's involved in casinos in Miami and in New Orleans. Lucky Luciano, he is also one of the members of the commission, and also one of these great big bootleggers. He also had side businesses. Again, recognizing that Prohibition was never going to last forever. So he was in the heroin business, and he was in the prostitution business. And he gets finally caught again. He murdered a whole bunch of people. He did not go to jail for murder. He went to jail for prostitution. One of his madams ratted him out, so to speak, and he landed up going to jail. What I talk about is the very end of the book about what happened to all these people who were members of the commission. And what happens to Luciano is because he's a naturalized citizen, the United States government right now, what they're doing is completely legal, and that is you can deport naturalized citizens for fraud. So he's deported to Sicily, and Meyer Lansky comes to his defense. This is later on, war is going on, and don't forget Sicily was part of the Mussolini's empire, and later would be part of when Mussolini is murdered, then Hitler takes, and the Germans take over what goes on in Italy. So what happens is, to keep him out of jail, Meyer Lansky makes a arrangement with the U.S. Navy that Luciano will keep his eyes open on the ports in Sicily to see what's going on with Mussolini, and then later on with him. And so and then Luciano just dies the natural death in Sicily in his 60s. And of course, Meyer Lansky lives to be much older. They take these guys to trial, and again, they don't realize that the public is really behind these guys. They never saw the really nasty stuff that went on, the murders that went on, the robberies that went on. The public didn't see this. They saw them as kind of like Robin Hoods. If you can relate to that, because you don't have much. These guys come along, they offer you a little bit, and you say, all right, it's something, and it's something that I like to do. And that's the whole thing. I like to drink. So why would it be a real issue about me drinking? And again, people who don't drink, all of a sudden when you have a prohibition, that's when they decide they want to drink. What you can have and want. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story, which is what happens to my grandfather when the government is started, even though he's been paying taxes, he gets a telephone call and they said, get out of the house because the feds are after you. And so my grandfather goes up the way he knows. He gets in the car, runs up to the Indian reservation. They take him in the United States side. They let him out on the Canadian side and take a boat from Halifax, Canada, and he goes back to Europe. He hides in Białystok, Poland, if anybody knows that, for months until the heat is off. I write about it once, but he did it more than once. He was gone for months at a time. And he goes to Europe, and he sees what's going on in Europe, and he goes to his family, and he pleads with his family to leave Poland and to come to the United States. He said, if you listen, you will see what's going on, and Europe is not a safe place for Jews. We really need to get the family. And my grandfather smuggled books. That's not going to be a big deal. He was going to get up in the same room he took. He's going to go to Halifax to get to the Indian reservation. Yeah, and they'll go to the New York City area. He was fairly unsuccessful. His sisters allowed some of the, or actually his aunt, not his sisters, allowed some of the younger people to leave, but only a handful. And here's the interesting thing. I don't have any people Jewish in this audience, but here's the interesting thing that my grandfather shows up with really nice clothing. He is no longer religiously observant. He's not wearing a kippah on his head. He doesn't go to shul every Friday night and Saturday. He doesn't pray 3 times a day. He's a completely different person than what they remember from the family. And they look at themselves and they said, with their different kinds of clothing, and they're spending so many hours in the pursuit of religious activity, and they're afraid. They don't want to come to America because they don't want to become my grandfather. And so there is this whole sense that if I leave this, I will be, Jews don't really believe in hell, but I will be a bad person if I leave this Białystok, Poland, and the life that I have here and come to America with its freewheeling ways and this prohibition and this gangsters. And here's my grandfather running for the gun. I mean, they say, this is not for, maybe for some young people, because they're not so committed to life one way or the other. And so that's a kind of important lesson. And later on, my grandfather will be involved in trying to get Jews out of Europe and into he wanted to bring it to America. But the people behind this movement wanted to go to Palestine. Yeah, wait here.
When he was in Poland.
Oh, I'd say probably in the late 20s, and then he would return. I didn't put it in the book because once I say it, what it's kind of boring. So as a novelist, So he did it a couple of times. It started in the late 20s. And goes back into the early 30s for a different reason. And Luciano was very helpful in trying to get the Jews out of Europe. This is before they evicted and sent them to Sicily, because he makes arrangements. Because my grandfather said, I can't get a boat from Hamburg, Germany, and bring it all across and then go to Palestine. I mean, I'm going to get caught by somebody's Coast Guard or somebody's Navy. It's too long a trip. So Luciano makes arrangements in Italy for the people in Germany and Poland, if they want to leave, to come to Italy, and they make an arrangement, because the boat from Italy then to Palestine is not such a big deal. And they're sort of in turmoil anyway, and it's not high-end country. You know, it's not like they have big navies. You know, talking about North Africa and stuff, places like that. And so that's a safe place for them. Yeah.
Could you just, when did your grandfather get involved with Dutch Schultz? Was he working as a bootlegger throughout all of Prohibition? And you mentioned Dutch Schultz died at a young age. When was that? So that's a three-part question.
Okay, so Dutch Schultz gets murdered in 1935. My grandfather gets involved with Dutch Schultz on the get-go, 1920. Prohibition is enacted by Congress, 1919 comes into effect in 1920. Dutch Schultz immediately recognizes that he wants to get some good stuff. He doesn't want to make it in the bathtub. He wants to get the stuff from Canada or Europe and dilute it 1,000 times and sell it that way. And so in 1920, he wants the votes. The other thing I talk about in the book is that in 1928, one of their bootlegging friends is Arnold Wilson, who is a gambler and a bootlegger, and comes, unlike almost all of the gangsters of the time, comes from a very wealthy family. There was no need for him to be looking for another way to make a couple of bucks. That was not it. He was a gambler. That was his. In 1928, he's murdered. They say by Dutch Schultz. Not proven, but that's proven. And so Dutch Schultz, my grandfather says to Dutch Schultz, Austin got really, really good. Let's go get a couple. And so he gets bigger boats, my grandfather. And now these boats can go, not only to Canada, these boats can actually go to Europe and pick up whiskey and scotch and all this stuff from Europe. And so now they get a better class of booze with much better boats. And that all because the Rothstein's dead, and they want to somebody wants to get rid of his boats. Did I answer your questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Did somebody else have a question over here? So yes, it's an interesting story. Now, almost all of these gangsters were white men, but in places like Harlem, there were, of course, black men, mostly men again, but there was one famous woman from Guadeloupe. She landed stuff in and she is the queen of the, not booze, she's not interested in booze, in the numbers round. So the numbers round, if anybody knows, for a penny. For a penny, you pick a number, and if your horses come in as the combination, and it was all rigged, so you can, a few people could win. Overall, nobody ever win. But and to this day, there's numbered rackets that go on. All the those kind of people. Pick a number. I think it's more legitimate now than it used to be. Anyway, she was the queen of Harlem.
So my husband's father ran the numbers in the 30s, but I thought it was the last numbers of the stock exchange for that thing.
My understanding is it was the horse races. Who came in first, second, and third? And listen, it could have been several different ways. I'm sure there are, different ways to make a dollar. I guarantee you it was not legit. And the fact is that they would give their pennies, and believe me, so a few fools would win. the rest of you giving away your money for nothing. So, yeah. Once the organized crime gets going in early 1920, there is unbelievable kinds of stuff they do. So, for example, there are a bunch of Jewish gangsters. They're not in. They got a different thing than it. So they go down to the Lower East Side to their fellow Jews, or floating manufacturers, shoe manufacturers, all kinds of places like that. They go and they say to the guys, they go to the owner of the factory and they say, you don't want to feel a factory into the ground. You need to give me some money every week. You need to give me some. He goes to the guy struggling, and in the beginnings, by some union, he goes to the union and said, everyone did that. You know, so they get money from both sides. That's extortion. That's what that game continues to this very day. Different actors, same idea. You go to the two different competing factions in a business, and you push them both for money. And that was what before Prohibition and long after Prohibition is today, this very day. There are these kinds of things going on as far as organization. And they learn their lesson during Prohibition. How many ways can we figure out to make money? And then later into the mid-20s, when the federal government started thinking about all the testing they may be in these gangsters, then it changes a little bit in terms of they start looking for different avenues. But what happens is you have this mindset. So if you looked in the 1950s, they were talking about the mafia and the commission and stuff. Well, they mislead you because that idea of the commission is immediately happens in the 1920s. Because already they know that their fellow gangsters are greedy bums. So they need to make sure that there are some boundaries. So even crooks have boundaries. And the other part of it is you can bribe the locals, but you got to be real careful about the feds. And so one of the reasons why Dutch Schultz did not survive into his 40s was not only was he greedy, but he wanted to go after Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor. And the commission, Luciano, Meyer, they look at each other and say, that is not a good idea because that will bring the entire federal government on top of us and will none of us will make it. So they kind of recognized there were some taboos about who you could be, who you should run away from and not do any harm to. But otherwise, they would kill each other rather frequently. And it is reported that Dutch Schultz took a safe and put $7 million in it and hid it in the Catskills. Now, is that true? Who knows? The guy who was involved with packing the $7 million into the safe was murdered by Dutch Schultz, one of the Weinberg brothers, who were also one of their chief guys who worked for them. So, and then after Schultz is dead, for quite, the feds were watching my grandfather's house because they figured he knew where the $7 million was hidden, because he had been close to Schultz, and Schultz must have told me. Well, that was not true. And then the gangsters were following my grandfather, thinking the same thing. Well, he was close to Schultz. He must know where the $7 million is. To this day, no one has, at least publicly said, they ever found the $7 million. Is it a legend? Who knows? But anyway, no one ever found it. But it was assumed at one point that my grandfather must know. And then my grandfather and my grandmother and one of his sisters, they went on a joyride looking for the $7 million. Because if anybody knows it's not the Monticello Catskills, but north of that, Cairo, Tannersville, those little towns is where those and other gangsters had their second homes to get away from the streets of New York. And so it's assumed that these towns are where that money must be hidden, but again, nobody knows what happened. Yes,
What's the main reason for prohibition and who was really behind it?
well, the people who are behind it now, I'm not giving you scientific information, I'm giving you family information, is that it was a lot of white Christian women, some of them involved in the suffrage movement, because the feeling was that these immigrants get drunk and beat their wives. So that was the mindset. Okay, now my grandfather said that because they were immigrants, they were Jews and Catholics, and they were after them. Maybe a little bit of both. I don't know for sure, but that was the group that was behind the prohibition. So, and well, everybody's trying to figure out, the roaring twenties is going on. There's a certain segment of the population that's in the free and easy life. The rest of the people are struggling. Yes.
What did your grandfather do after Schultz was murdered?
You have to buy the book. But later on, when the country goes to war, when they proudly go to the Grumman airplane factory and make planes for the boys.
But did he continue in illegal
No,
endeavors?
he didn't give up his gun but he kept his boats. He put the kids to work, taking care of the boats and the fishing. And unfortunately, because of the Great Depression, none of my grandfather's businesses ever really survived into the 1940s. So it was good for what it was. And no one in the family ever got rich, but they were all alive. They were not murder victims. Yes.
Accurate were the gangster movies, 30s.
Well, people love gangsters. We were in love with gangsters. And as the depression gets worse, you're looking for Robin Hood. And there were a few. Bank and they give a few to local people and the rest they keep for themselves. Most people were really not nice human beings. They really weren't. I mean, if you were willing to do something so illegal that the federal government is after you. Yeah, it's tough to be a nice person. I believe my grandfather was a nice person. But who knows? Did he ever kill anybody? To the best of my knowledge, no, he never did. He carried a gun just to show, just because everybody else had a gun, and if he showed it, then it was like maybe the other worker would put their gun down and they would both be alive. Because it was never his intent and it wasn't that his intent to get rich. His intent was largely to survive and make sure his family didn't get killed. Did somebody else have a question out there?
My favorite movie is Some Like It Hot.
Oh,
Now they're doing the musical.
well, if you've watched that movie, if you watch The Godfather 2, where you see Michael goes into the bathroom, gets the gun, and they have a shootout, that actually is what happened with Dutch Schultz in a New Jersey Chinese restaurant. He went into the bathroom. He actually had a gun. He didn't have to search for it. He came back out, and there was a shooting match, and he didn't even die at first. It took quite a while for him to actually die. And in the interim, the people who tried to kill him, they all of them were actually later on murdered because they didn't want witnesses about what they actually were doing. So, again, these were not nice people. If you could easily and casually murder somebody, you can't possibly be a nice guy. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. I don't think you can turn it on and off like that. So, yeah, and the times are crazy. They were definitely crazy. The United States was becoming this great and powerful nation. Europe was devastated really by what happened in World War One. Big major countries, England, France, Germany itself had a war. I mean, the world was really on a turning point in terms of what was going to happen next. The unresolved issues of World War One actually led 20 years later to World War Two. And my grandfather, got caught up in this and trying to save his family. He always regretted he was unsuccessful. And there's not much you can, say about that. Except this is, these are the realities of what was perceived to be a very different world in America than what actually was going on in Europe. People were a lot poorer in Europe I mean, we had some tough times with Dust Bowl and things like that, but in general, we were a huge country geographically. We had a very large population. And we welcomed immigrants. We wanted them. We needed workers. They needed workers for the factories. They needed workers for the fields. They needed workers to milk the cows. So we were this big land of opportunity in places in the world where, they remembered 1,000 years of history, and they would go and kill each other over 1,000 years of history. On my father's side, we're Hungarian, and Hungary was always being torn apart. They were constantly killing the Romanians. The Romanians were constantly killing the Hungarians. I mean, they were just, England and France were constantly going to war killing each other. We didn't have that. We didn't have that. I mean, we were trying to kill off the Native Americans, and now and then we try to kill the Mexicans. But we just weren't like that. We were young. We had young ideas. We were a real democracy, which was. There was no precedent for it. I mean, there are other countries, the French had this great revolution. What happens? They go back and then they're put in a dictator. We didn't do that. So, I mean, we were living in that time period. My grandfather was so proud to be American. He was born in Jersey City. So proud of that. And I don't think, we have any sense of that anymore. I mean, you could disagree with your government, but still you felt so proud to be part of this country. It wasn't true for everyone. And listen, in the 20th century, we had the very, very nasty wars. We just were killing each other left and right. So yes, yeah. That's what happened. And my grandfather started those businesses largely to protect himself from the government coming after him for this tax evasion. And he had these cousins that he needed for them to get something to do. We created these little businesses, and they served their purpose. And then, of course, they kind of fell apart. But to the day he died, my grandfather kept his post. He could no longer go out and go fishing, and so people helped with doing the charter business, taking people out to go fishing rather than actually doing the fishing itself. There probably was more money in doing that than there actually was in actually fishing. My mother always talked about the fact that for the fishing, they used my grandmother was kosher, right? So they didn't eat shellfish. Just a no. However, my mother and her sisters would go clamming for the purposes of using it for bait. So they never ate it. And my mother hated it because it was dirty, and you're out there in the sand and the dirt and you're clamming. But that's what happened. And so younger generation, in the 40s they don't mind. And then in my father's family, they also had fishermen in Miami. I don't know why, because generally you don't think about Jewish people as being in the fishing business, but for whatever reason, that's in my blood. Everybody wants to be a fisherman. I don't really like to go on fishing. I had two fish. But my mother, who passed at 99, she loved to go fishing. And she had no She did not mind putting the bait on the hook. So anyway, that's a story which I have hopefully captured in the book, which you can find. I can autograph today for you. And then my many other books that I have. Yes, sir.
Not beer, was the purple good in the-
Yes. Yes. But there was less money in beer than there was, you know, I'll realize.
Something about 3.2.
Yeah, yeah, most of the time the beer was all, they were smashing beer gardens as well. Yeah. Anybody, yeah, yes, yes.
Did you know your grandfather?
No, not really, no, I was too young. And they say, my grandmother died first. And then he died 6 months later. They were very much still in love. And they said he died of a broken. That's the thing. And I talk about my grandmother in here. And then I talk about the things that my mother loved to talk about. And that is, so my grandfather has boats. He's got fish. He's got cats. Keep the rats, the water rats away. So he's a bunch of cats. My mother loved these cats. She just loved, and then my grandmother used to chop off the fish's head and eat it raw to the cat. And they had an incredible glutton. They were, you know, it's not knowing what food is awful. And then they had the German shepherds, which my mother loved. And so I talk about the German shepherds, Ruby. And then my grandmother had a cow. When the weather was decent, and it was, could be like 9 months out of the year, the parrot had a nice big cage on the porch. The parrot really talked. It was called Polly, but it was a boy. And Polly, you know, so my aunt's out in the street and the parrot said, "What?" And then every time my grandfather comes home, and he usually came home at 7 o'clock in the morning, but my grandmother was already up and the parrot was there. So that's the stuff that, as a kid, growing up in this environment, that's the stuff that my mother remembers. And I put them in because that was, you know, that's the cutesy kind of stuff that has nothing to do with the violence that was going on. And then, you know, my grandmother was just always a nervous wreck, always thinking that he was going to get killed. But ever so grateful when they could get out of this business and simply, you know, he's the word that he might get, the boat might get overturned because of the water, the weather, but nothing like what follows. Yes.
I think if everybody in this room digs deep enough, we probably all have a few stories, if not of the Depression, that maybe Prohibition. 2 short stories will take 2 minutes. My wife's grandmother, they say, had a still in her attic. And that is, she worked with someone local here. And that's how she supported her family of 10 for about 5 to 8 years. And I also was told by my father that my grandfather, his father, had a cousin in the New York City area that happened to be an enforcer. That's all I know about the guy. He had the same last name as me, but outside of that, I know nothing. But if we dig deep enough, I bet you there's a lot of stories like that.
Well, when people are hungry enough, and you need to protect your family, I mean, people are willing to do things that ordinarily they would never do. I mean, the 20th century sees this incredible World War I, then it goes through this incredible depression, then we have World War II. So people, when they're hungry and you want to feed your family, you're willing to take risks that you normally would never consider. But the time produced prohibition. And that then produced things that were unintended consequences. The fact that organized crime got so organized, unanticipated, but it became the root because I don't think anyone, when they started to put in prohibition, had any idea about how much money was going to be involved. Because it turns out, when you tell people they can't have something, all of a sudden they want it. They may not want to drink every day of their lives, but if you tell them they can't drink, then at least once a week, maybe they want to drink. And there you go. You got a whole bunch of people taking a sample. I mean, that's what, it wasn't the heavy drinkers. It was the people who ordinarily would not drink. Said, well, if you can't do it, especially young people, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. You tell them they can't do it, they say, must be something worthwhile doing. So that's what happened. And it was just a period of, we're only living into a kind of pretty strange time at the moment. But we'll see how that shapes out. But, yeah, and with a lot of to write this book.
Other than your book, which talks about prohibition, do you have any other, would you recommend any other books to read to find out more information about it? Because I really don't know. I would like to learn a little bit more about it, because I know that, it was, again, you couldn't drink or anything, but do you have any other stories or novels that you could recommend that would be interesting to read to get more information?
Honestly, no.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Yes,
We had our own, resident gangsters. They call me corny. Buffalo's Polish Gangsters. And they're written by a local gentleman, Michael Rizzo. In case this lady is interested.
Oh, okay. Maybe you should go on one of the explore Buffalo tours with the gangsters too. That would be.
I'm saying, he writes
But he had a
books.
University Express thing.
And they call me
Right.
corny.
And they,
Oh,
I did last semester, maybe I had to go, I don't remember.
okay.
the loves gangsters. Hear about them. And listen, there were all those, during the middle of the Depression, there were all those gangsters who were robbing banks. If you remember, and they were heroes. These are the banks foreclosing the farm and the homes across the country. And people they just couldn't believe it. And if you killed a bank teller or a bank manager, who cares? They were considered to be evil people because they're taking your whole family's work away from you. So they became, top heroes. But I guarantee you, most of them were not nice people. If you're going to take a gun and try to rob somebody and kill someone in the process, believe me, this is not someone you want to take home for dinner. Yes.
Do you know the origin of the term speakeasy?
No, I don't, but, it's used constantly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were all over during Prohibition. And then to make everybody happy, a couple of them every month were invaded by the feds and killed a lot of them. Lo and behold, they did their. For instance, I have these wonderful book that can be ordered, and then there's other books that I've written under my name, and I write mysteries under a pen name. I'm actually going to be doing.
That's still your name?
Harriet Goodman Grayson is my name.
Your name.
Anastasia Goodman is my pen name. And I'm teaching a class on the history of mystery at the Amherst Senior Center. Read mystery, we talk about the emergence of women writers in the 19th century.
Is that part of the university?
No,
No, I don't think so.
at the Amherst, catalog class
Oh, okay.
that are paid classes.
What's it called again? What did you say what was the name of it?
Oh, the history of mystery. The history of mystery, yeah, it's fascinating, and because mysteries don't have the same panache as a novelist. Women's, sort of, they want the world is open for women. Because it was things of lowbrow fiction rather than the great murder. Thank you.
I can't read it, I don't library.
So that